Would you like to share your screen, please?
Yeah.
Sumesh, can we record your talk?
No problem. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
So a brief introduction. Professor Sumesh is a faculty member in the Department of Chemical Engineering here at IIT Madras. He received his PhD from JNC SAR Bangalore, and he's going to talk today about lattice Boltzmann simulations for soft matter. Over to you, Professor Sumesh.
Okay. Thank you, Parag. Thanks for the invitation from Ratna and Anand and other organizers of this workshop. Um, So I'm going to talk about, as Parag mentioned, lattice Boltzmann as a technique to understand soft matter. So yeah. So this is what I'm planning to talk about in the next 30 minutes. I understand this is a computational workshop, but I'm planning to spend maybe 1/3 of the time trying to tell you about what is soft matter and what are the challenges associated with this material, so that one needs to go for a computational method as a way of understanding the material. And then I'll introduce you to some simple concepts in lattice Boltzmann, and I'll end up with showing you some of the examples where this particular technique has been proven to be very useful. So if you have questions in between, please go ahead and ask. So I would start by telling you a little bit about soft matter. So soft matter, it's typically one define it as something that's which between a simple liquid and a crystalline solid. So the best way to see it is to see some of the examples. So the one example that you're seeing on the screen right now, this is actually an emulsion. So when I say an emulsion, it's small droplets of one liquid that's dispersed in another, like oil droplets dispersed in water, or it could be solid particles. The point is that the size of the particle would be typically few nanometers to few hundreds of microns in size. So that's much smaller than what you can perceive with the naked eye, and you have a large collection of them that is dispersed. Okay, so that's called a colloidal dispersion. That's an example of soft matter. Another example is polymeric solutions or polymeric melts. Okay, when you have these long chain molecules that are that itself forms a matrix. Another very important matter which is which comes under this category is liquid crystals. So this is again long chain molecules, and the fact that because this is like a long rod like molecule, they can get states that looks different between from liquid and the normal crystalline solid. So you could have liquid crystals, or many of the biological materials like cells, tissues, or things which are present inside the cell, like the cellular filaments and so on. So all these matter typically come under the category of soft matter. So what is specific about these this material? Okay, so all of them essentially has microstructure associated with it. So when I say microstructure, there is something that has a length scale which is between and that of an atom and that of a macroscopic scale. So let's, for example, look at the first case where I talked about colloidal dispersions. You have droplets or particles. So these particles are definitely much bigger than the size of an atom, but is still much smaller than, like, what you see, like, on a centimeter scale or on a millimeter scale. So you have these particles that are present in the system. So that brings an additional length scale where different physics could happen. Okay, in case of polymer melts, as I said, these are essentially polymer chains. So these polymer chains themselves give rise to one particular length scale, or it could be like, the cluster of polymer molecules. They may behave in a certain fashion, they may be cross-linked and so on. So that gives you another length scale in the problem, where the physics is not really driven by what happens at the molecular scale or the atomic scale, nor is it what happens at a large scale. Okay, there is another length scale that comes into the picture. In case of liquid crystals, again there exists a variety of states. So one example that I have shown here is that can be formed if the molecules that are making up of this liquid crystal are chiral in nature, meaning they have got some kind of a rotational structure, and that can give rise to certain self-assembled. So in other words, they could form certain structures which are much bigger than that of a molecule, but still much smaller than the material length scale itself. And in case of cells, as I said, depending upon what you look at, maybe the filaments or the cluster of filaments or the cluster of cells, all of them could give rise to physics at different scales. Okay, so there is a length scale that becomes important when you start talking about soft matter. And it's not just the length scale. The thing is that at this length scale, where whatever I'm talking about, it's so small that the thermal fluctuations become important. In other words, the fact that the everything is not deterministic, the motion can be stochastic, becomes important. So for example, the polymer molecules, the chains may be continuously undergoing fluctuations, they may be continuously undergoing a translational motion and so on. Okay, just because it has got a thermal energy available to it. The third feature is the fact what I call as the self-assembly, meaning they all have a tendency to self-assemble the structure. Okay, so you don't need to put a external force and then make a structure, but they themselves have a tendency to form self-assembled structures. And this is because there is a competition that comes from the entropy and the enthalpy in the system. So it's a very delicate balance, because these systems which can be easily moved around with thermal energy, okay, can so if when they self-assemble, they can actually reduce the total free energy in the system. So these are various aspects of soft matter. So why should one and moreover, okay, so what I have been talking about so far is if the system is static, meaning that you are not applying an external force and you're just looking at what happens. But then the things could become more interesting if you're going to apply an external force. Okay, and then the system is driven out of equilibrium, and again complex dynamics happens. So why does one study soft matter? I think almost everything that you nowadays deal with in your day-to-day life has or is an example of soft matter. So here are a few examples. So what you see here, it's paint. Okay, paint is essentially a colloidal dispersion. So the the soap solutions and so on, where you will have surfactants which are dispersed, and the surfactants themselves will form certain structures in its in the fluid in which it is dispersed. Polymers, so this example I have shown is some plastic, but you know that it's basically made up of polymer melts and then molded into various forms and so on. Several food like chocolate and creams and so on, these are all either dispersions or are colloidal dispersions or emulsions. The liquid crystal displays, okay, so there how important it is nowadays in engines, the lubricating oil and so on, many of the cosmetic stuff, and overall your body itself, that itself is an example of soft matter, because if you go to the cellular levels or tissue levels, you need to start looking at things from a different point of view. So there's a whole variety of examples or materials that come under this particular classification. So now, why did I say so much about the particular length scale and the constituents? Okay, so I primarily want to talk about the flow of soft matter. And what I want to convince you is that the particular structure, the microstructure that the system has, is important in making these materials flow in a way that is different from the usual fluids. Okay, so just let's look at what we know about the flow of normal liquids. Let's say you take water and put it between two plates, and the way you would have learned the definition of viscosity is that you apply a stress or a force on the top plate. You try to move it with a certain velocity, okay, and as a consequence the fluid between the plates move, and of course the bottom plate is not moving but the top plate is moving, so that means it's going to create a velocity gradient, and the force that you have to apply is going to be proportional to this gradient with a proportionality constant, which is what we call as the viscosity. Okay, so the viscosity is, that's how you define it. But what happens if you go and see it on a molecular level? Okay, so I'm going to do that now. Let's say I take one of the points from this. Okay, let's say one arrow, and I'm going to zoom in at that region. So this line S is one particular point in the fluid, and then I'm going to zoom into that region, and I see a lot of molecules around. Okay, to distinguish all the molecules that I am seeing above the line under consideration is open circles, and all the ones which are below are closed or dashed circles, okay, shaded ones. Now, you know that all of them are moving around, and the fact that they are all moving around, meaning that some of the, the shaded ones are going to go up, while some of the open ones are going to go down, right? Now, the fact that if there exists a velocity gradient, that would mean that all the open ones will have a larger velocity in the horizontal direction compared to the shaded ones. And therefore, because of this mixing, that some of the shaded ones go up, some of the open ones go down, means that there is going to be an exchange of momentum of the fluids from above to below and below to above. In other words, the faster moving molecules can come down, the slower moving molecules will go up. Okay, so that's how the transfer of momentum happens, and viscosity precisely captures how effectively that momentum transfer happens. Okay, so this is where you just need one quantity to describe what happens on a molecular level, which we of course don't see it on a molecular level. We look at it on a much larger scale and see it. Okay, so this is what would have happened if you have simple molecules that constitute the fluid. Now, to tell you that, when you have another length scale in the system, the things could be much more complicated. So to see why it could be complicated, I have shown some examples here. So here what you're seeing is one of the filament. This is an acting filament. So it's a filament that you typically have it inside the cells, and that particular filament is put in a fluid and it's being sheared. So meaning that it's basically subjected to exactly the flow that I showed earlier, where the top plate is moved, with some certain velocity. Now, one thing that you immediately see is that the whole filament is fluctuating. Okay, that's because of the thermal motion. Over and above, this filament is undergoing several things. One is that it's basically folding itself. Okay, and as a result of that, it's also undergoing some sort of a tumbling motion. So the presence of a flow around this filament is making the filament to do certain actions, okay, which wouldn't happen if you were to think about it on a molecular scale. It's a similar thing that is shown here at the bottom, where you actually have a single droplet and it is subjected to a simple shear flow. So the drop remains a spherical when there is no flow around it, but the moment you start shearing it, the drop basically gets deformed, like, the spherical becomes deformed, and it gets deformed more and more. And if the shear is so strong, then it's possible that, it basically will extend quite a bit. It may break up in that process also. So several interesting things could happen when, in one of the individual particle or a filament or a drop is present in the fluid, and when it is moving. Moreover, if you think about it as the different constituents of soft matter, let's say the polymer chains are going to, under a shear, they may disentangle, they may align in a particular direction. So a structure which looked like this in the static case would look more like that in the case of when it's subjected to a simple shear flow. Similarly, if you had droplets, for example, they may all get elongated, let's say under a shear. It's also possible that in a static case, when the fluctuations would keep it in a particular configuration, in the case of a flow, they may get arranged in a particular fashion. So you can see that there is some positional order that has come at the figure below compared to the top one. Or in case of liquid crystals, which are mostly like, rod-like molecules, they may also start aligning in certain fashion. This is another example where it could be, a chain. How would it behave? So in all these cases, again, the top row shows when there is no flow, while the bottom row shows when there is a flow. And this difference is what is important. So I am showing you 3 examples where the filament is a flexible filament or a droplet or a set of structures, okay, where the structure itself is determined by what the flow has done to it. Okay, but now the point is that this particular structure decides how effectively momentum transfer happens across various layers. So when you had simple molecules, it was just the simple Brownian motion without the molecules changing its structure. But now when you start worrying about soft matter and when you start talking about its flow, the microstructure, the structure of the molecule of the material itself, it gets modified because of the flow. In other words, there is going to be a coupling between the flow and the structure. That's what I have tried to show here. You have a structure. The structure decided by what the flow is, but that structure decides how the momentum transfer happens. I have written it as in terms of stress, and that stress is dependent upon structure. So there's a structure flow coupling, and this coupling is what needs to be accounted for when you want to talk about flow of soft materials. Okay, now as I said, these are very concentrated suspensions that typically it's not like a single filament, but you will have a huge number of them. Let's say if it's liquid crystal, you have huge number of molecules, and it's not possible to look at each of them in a simple fashion. But also on the other hand, you don't know what exactly the structure or how the structure is going to be modified under the flow. Okay, so that's where the computations come in, because there is simply large degree of information that needs to go in. So that's why you need to look at a computational approach is appropriate. So what may be the computational approach one can take? So here on the x-axis, I have denoted length, and on the y-axis, I have time. Okay, so when lengths are very small or when time is very small, then you actually see things on a molecular scale. So where typically to understand the system, you will use molecular dynamics simulations. On the other hand, when the length is very large, let's say centimeters or larger, and the time scale is bigger, when I say bigger, it's like, seconds or minutes and so on, then typically you could use a continuum simulation. Like if it's a fluid, you will use a computational fluid dynamics technique. But something that soft matter, I said, has a length scale which is in between, which is much larger than the molecular length and smaller than the conventional or the material scale that we use, and that's a mesoscale at which quite a lot of things happen, and we want to essentially concentrate in that intermediate regime. And Lattice Boltzmann technique is a suitable technique for that. Okay, so there are many other methods as well which are used typically in the mesoscale. For this mesoscale simulation, I find Lattice Boltzmann quite useful to do soft matter flow of soft matter because it seems to work well for several systems. So okay, so that basically brings me to the introduction and motivation of this talk, that why one needs to do a computational approach. Okay, now I'm going to briefly talk about how one works with Lattice Boltzmann. So again, I'm going to talk about the Lattice Boltzmann method of a simple fluid, and then I'll tell you how to expand it for a general case, and then we will see some examples. So imagine you have a stationary gas. Okay, so then when I say stationary, that doesn't mean that all the molecules are stationary. They are all moving around, right? And then you also know that you can actually calculate what is the velocity with which these molecules are moving around. And typically um, when there is these molecules have a velocity distribution, meaning that some of them may have a small velocity, some of them will be moving with very large velocity, and they follow a distribution which is known as the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution. Okay, so this is essentially the mathematical form of the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution. And this is what happens when they are all static. Let's skip this. Okay, now you have a system, let's say, where the fluid is taken, let's say, in this particular container. Okay, again, imagine these are all small, simple molecules. Okay, and then to describe how many molecules are there, one thing is that we could say how many molecules are there per unit area or unit volume. Okay, but we also know that these molecules have got different velocities. And therefore, what we do is we define a distribution function, which I call f, which is called the particle distribution function. It tells me how many molecules or how many particles are there at a given location x, okay, having a particular velocity zeta, because I know that they all have got different velocities at a particular time t. So this is the basic quantity that comes in Boltzmann equation. So you remember, this is actually a thing that is function of space, velocity, and time. Okay, so just the way you can say that if you have density and you integrate the density over the volume, you will get mass. Similarly, if you have a quantity f, okay, you integrate in the velocity space and in the physical space, and you will get the mass. Okay, because you have f now defined in both velocity space and physical space. So you can calculate, let's say, the integrate the distribution with respect to the velocity space to calculate density. If you want to calculate the momentum, you just need to calculate the first moment with respect in the velocity space. If you want energy, you could do the second moment, and so on. Okay, so this is the basic quantity that you can use. And this, let me skip, and then I come to Boltzmann equation. So if f is the basic probability density function, you can write down a governing equation for the this probability. Okay, so this equation is what it is, and this is known as the Boltzmann equation. Okay, this guy's got two parts. On the left hand side, it tells you how it evolves in velocity space and physical space. On the right hand side, it tells you how a distribution function relaxes to the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution. Okay, because every time the system wants to relax to that distribution function. So you could use a simple operator. Again, I'll not go into the details, but it's known as a BGK operator, which you can use. And this particular equation can be used to solve Boltzmann equation. Okay, so again, in the lattice Boltzmann equation is essentially the same Boltzmann equation, but a discretized version. Okay, is what is used, and the equation looks very simple because there is a part which is just tells you how the distribution functions move around in space. Okay, which comes from the fact that there is an advection operation on this distribution function in Boltzmann equation, and then there is a collision or a relaxation operation, and these are the only two operations that you do when you do the lattice Boltzmann method. Okay, so there is an so in terms of actual coding or actual implementation, you can forget about all the theory that I spoke about. There are just two steps one needs to do. One is called a streaming step, in which you define the density at or the distribution function at every point, and you move them in various directions. And in the second step, you basically get them relaxed and again move and relax. and this process is continued, and that's what actually gives rise to, that becomes essentially equivalent to solving Lattice Boltzmann equation. So there are no nonlinear equations that you need to solve. There's no finite difference operations that you need to do. Everything is basically just two operations, what is called as a streaming and collision operation. Okay, so the good thing about streaming collision operation is therefore that it conserves mass in the system exactly. It becomes very easy to parallelize and so on. So that's why Lattice Boltzmann has become quite a popular technique. So therefore this is the just overview of Lattice Boltzmann technique if you apply it for a simple fluid. Okay, now when you have a complex material like the soft matter I spoke about, as I said, if you have a filament, the filament may be undergoing some sort of motion, it may have certain orientation. If I have a droplet, it may deform, it may orient in certain way. So you need to essentially account for all such effects. So you can define yet another probability function. Okay, that probability will tell you how many of them are there, on what locations are there, how many of them are actually aligned in a particular fashion, and so on. So if it is droplet, it would be like the orientation of a deformed droplet. If it's a polymer chain, it is like it's basically how a polymer chain is oriented. Or if it's a liquid crystal molecule, it tells you the orientation of the liquid crystal and so on. So again, this is an equation that I have written down. Again, you forget about the equation. It tells you what is the probability of having certain things under a particular configuration. So it has got various names. Some people call it Fokker-Planck, Smoluchowski, and so on. But it's basically a probability evolution equation. Okay, so you have a probability evolution equation to tell you the configuration of the soft matter. You have Boltzmann equation to tell you how mass and momentum evolves in the material, and if you couple the two, you basically be able to solve for the soft matter. So again, since the second equation, the one which again talks about the configuration of the material, is a probability description, you can use the same technique that you use for the Boltzmann equation to solve even the second equation in a coupled fashion. Okay, and that essentially solves the flow of the soft matter. So this is how typically Lattice Boltzmann method is used to solve the flow of soft matter. So in the so I have another 5 minutes, no? Parag?
Yes, you have another 5 minutes. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll just briefly tell you some of the examples where things have worked very well with this approach. Okay. So here are some examples. So the first row. So here, this is essentially a particle stabilized emulsion. Meaning, imagine you have oil droplets in water, and over and above you have got colloidal solid particles dispersed. So these are all these green particles, okay, dispersed in a blue and a red fluid. So you can see that it's quite dense suspension, okay, and this can stay in various forms. Either the droplets remain as a droplet, or it can actually form a continuous structure called a bigel structure that you see here. The particle could be spherical, as you see on the right hand side, or anisotropic, okay, as you see on the left hand side. And these structures have been able to or Lattice Boltzmann has been able to successfully generate such structures. So now you imagine the complexities that go in, because you have got two phases, so you need to account for that. You have got particles which may be present either in the bulk of the fluid, or the particles may be present on the interface. And and these particles need not be static. The particles themselves could be moving. The particles could also undergo thermal motion. Okay, but all these ingredients can be easily built into the framework that I just spoke about. Not only that, if the bottom part essentially tells you how these if you want to look at individual molecules or individual particles, how the flow around it can be. Okay, so here actually what you're seeing is the blue is one particle, and the red is essentially a droplet around it, and suppose you shear it in a certain fashion, how the droplet can split and then it can come out, what could be the flow field around it, and so on. So in other words, multi-phase kind of any kind of particles, whether it is the particles could be in the bulk or at the interface, multiple particles and all kind of interactions including hydrodynamic interaction, interface mediated interaction can all be incorporated in the method that we spoke about in that general framework. This is yet another example where Lattice Boltzmann has successfully picked up the elastic instabilities that are present in polymer fluids. Okay, so I think I'll just skip this, but yeah, you can again do polymeric materials. Liquid crystals is one another application where Lattice Boltzmann has done extremely well. So people who are familiar with liquid crystals know that topological defects in these liquid crystals are sort of signatures of what is the underlying structure of this material. So typically when you want to show the liquid crystal, you end up showing the defects. Defects meaning essentially mistakes in the order in the system. So liquid crystal will have certain orientational order, but that there will also be some mistakes, and it's easy to actually see those mistakes and identify those mistakes, and that tells you a whole lot about how the material itself is, and how the material is moving can also be figured out by figuring out how the mistakes move. So here on the right hand side, what you're seeing is a colloidal particle with a liquid crystal around it, and these blue patches are supposed to tell you about the defects that form on the surface of a colloidal particle. And the defects could be very complicated, as you see in the later figures, and Lattice Boltzmann has able to successfully figure out these structures. And this has been very important because otherwise getting these shapes without computation is a pretty complicated thing. Okay, so this is only with the simulation that you can sort of calculate these things and then start comparing with experiments. And the last example that I just want to show is in the context of biology, okay, or in the context of living matter, where again Lattice Boltzmann has done extremely well. So some of the examples, so here on the left hand side what you see is the material inside the cell. Okay, if you confine it into, say, microfluidic channel, what kind of flow is generated? Sometimes you get this nice flow around in a channel, or it could be very turbulent like, and the pictures at the bottom is essentially has been able to um, generate exactly similar flow in the same framework that I spoke about in terms of turbulent like flow and so on. Or you could even look at things on a smaller scale where you have two particles. One of them could be, for example, a bacteria. So in this particular simulation, it's expected to show that the red is a bacteria and the white is just a passive particle. And if the passive particle and this bacteria, a spherical bacteria, you imagine, if they come in contact with each other, what kind of a flow is generated, how is this entire collision process happen, and so on. So here this is example is just that of one of them, while here this is like you can imagine several of the living species if you put together, or like a cellular network and so on, where again you have system which is a living thing. So in all these contexts, Lattice Boltzmann has done very well. So with that, I'll stop. I'll just summarize saying that looking at the material from a microscopic or a mesoscopic point of view is extremely rewarding, and only thing is that there is a large degree of freedom associated with it when you look at them, and therefore computation is one of the best way of tackling such a problem, and Lattice Boltzmann method provides you that tool to do that. Okay, so I'll stop there. I'll be happy to take any questions if you have.
Thank you, Professor Sumesh, for that wonderful introduction to the Lattice Boltzmann method. So, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open now for questions. I think Balakrishnan has been raising his hand for a while now. Sir, could you unmute yourself and ask?
I have unmuted him, but he didn't speak. So maybe I have unmuted Mr. Edwin Joseph. Can we allow him?
Yes, please.
Yes, sir. So, sir, how do we incorporate the multiple particle interactions in this lattice Boltzmann method? Does lattice Boltzmann method only can we specify? Suppose this is a particular particle, this is a particular particle of a material. Is it possible?
Yeah, so you you need to identify, I mean, you need to essentially specifically say what each particle is and where it is, and you need to track the particle. Okay, just like what you would do in any normal computation. But the simplicity comes from the fact that it's very easy to impose the boundary conditions on the surface of the particle. So generally, let's say when you solve things on a Cartesian mesh and you have a spherical particle, the spherical particle doesn't conform to the Cartesian mesh, and that's where the challenge comes in. Even on lattice Boltzmann, you typically do it with a Cartesian mesh, but still the way the probability equation is written, if you look at it from the point of view of that equation, it's actually quite easy to impose the boundary condition on the surface of the particle, and depending upon where you specify that boundary condition means you're actually specifying where the particles are, what is the shape of the particle, and so on. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Sir, I have one more question. What are some of the properties that you validate using this LB method with experiments? Because the scales are totally different.
Right. So you can, so that is the good thing, that you can actually look at the macroscopic properties and see whether your simulation is able to pick it up. So for example, the last example that I showed you where I was looking at the flow of living things. Okay. So one of the recent observation was that if you take living material and then you start confine it more and more between two plates, then what happens is that the flow becomes more and more turbulent. Now that is something which is unexpected, because the more you constrain a system, you expect that you will have more control and the flow is expected to be more and more laminar like. But a living material shows exactly the opposite thing. And then the lattice Boltzmann has been able to essentially capture that. So it's such comparisons with the experimental observations is what one could pick up. And then because you have computation, you can actually go back and see what aspect from the computation gave you this particular behavior. So you can, in short, you can still look at the macroscopic properties, flow properties, or any other. So in case of liquid crystals, you could look at the way the defects are coming up and so on. So yeah, you can look at the macroscopic properties.
So one final question. Typical lattice Boltzmann simulation, how long does it take to run a simulation?
Yeah, so depending upon how well you have written the code and how much parallelized it is. So serial codes for some of the typical scales that I spoke about can take a few days to few weeks. But Lattice Boltzmann is a method which is extremely amenable to parallelization, because all the operations are very much local, and therefore you can parallelize it very easily. And if you do that efficiently, you can save quite a lot of time. And that's one of the advantages of Lattice Boltzmann.
Thank you, sir, for the answers. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
There's one more question from Adarsh in the chat box and from Deepak Sahu also. Yeah, maybe you can.
Okay, so that means I probably need to stop sharing to see the chat box. Yeah.
How are you able to see the movements of the
Yes.
filament? Yeah.
So I guess you are talking about the first example that I showed you. So that's an experimental paper. I do not know what technique they used to see it. It must be, I mean, some pretty strong microscopy, but I don't know what experimental method was used. If you just send me an email, I could send you the paper and you can probably take a look at what it is. Yeah, I don't know the experimental details of that work. I just wanted to motivate you to tell you how complex systems can be. Yeah. And the other question is, can we compare differential lattice Boltzmann with the coarse grain molecular dynamics simulation? You can compare with coarse grain molecular simulation. In fact, lattice Boltzmann is essentially, if you think about it from a theoretical point of view, lattice Boltzmann is a coarse grained version of MD. Okay, so there is nothing that's gonna prevent you from doing that. Only thing is that lattice Boltzmann can cover time scales and length scales much faster than what MD could do. Okay, so in MD, so even a short time step in lattice Boltzmann, MD will take, I think, ages to reach that state. So if there's something specific that you want to sort of compare, you can do that. And I think there are some studies in the literature where people have looked at how the interfaces form and the interfaces fluctuate from both the lattice Boltzmann point of view as well as from an MD point of view, where they have been able to bridge, because the length that you are looking at is typically the size of the interface or the thickness of the interface, which is which you can approach from MD as well as from LB. Yeah, does that answer the Deebug's question? Okay.
Great. Okay, so maybe we can, if there are no more questions, we can close this session. Thank you, Professor Sumesh, for that wonderful talk again.
Thanks, Parag.
We will reconvene after 20 minutes. So at 5:40, is that right, Ratna?